and he'll talk to us about the future of coal and clean coal technologies. It's a great pleasure to welcome and invite David Arfin, who is a special advisor to the Department of Energy and the founder and CEO of First Energy Finance. David is driven to bring innovative finance to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and other clean energy technologies. He's a very famous man, and we're really delighted that he could join us. He actually invented SolarCity's groundbreaking solar lease product, which is a first-of-kind solar financing program that has enabled the adoption of over 10,000 residential customer and government customers to adopt solar power. In 2009, solar lease was named by Scientific American as the first of 20 world-changing ideas to build a cleaner, healthier, and smarter world. He also received the first ever Innovation in PV Financing Award from the Solar Energy Industry Association. I mean it when I say he's a very famous man. Prior to joining SolarCity, David was co-founder and CEO of Glue Labs that was acquired by Cisco Systems. He also co-founded Flywheel Communications and was founder and CEO of the CLE Group that was acquired by Practicing Law Institute. He received his MBA from the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. We went to the same school, but this is not the right time for it. He has an MBA in Public Policy Analysis from Claremont Graduate University and a BA in Political Science from UCLA. Please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is the mic working? Okay, great. I'm never soft-spoken, so it's usually not an issue. So pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Just to get a sense of who is in the room, how many kind of business/policy, raise your hand if you're business/policy type person. Okay, and raise your hand if you are in the sciences or engineering, the hard sciences or engineering. Great. This is what makes universities great, which is we're in a room together where innovation needs to happen not only through better, faster, cheaper methods and processes, but also through people thinking about policy implications, as well as business elements. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go through a few slides. We'll have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end. And if you have a burning question, urgent question, please feel free to raise it. And during Q&A, nothing is off limits. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I feel a little bit like an imposter for being here and speaking at a session like this, because going back to 2006, I really had no knowledge of anything in the energy field. I could not tell you what a kilowatt was or a kilowatt hour. I never thought about corporate tax credits other than maybe to nod my head when a political candidate says, yes, we're going to get rid of corporate welfare and these gifts to corporations. Accounting was the bane of my existence at business school, and I never wanted to think about depreciation rates or credits again and how that fits in. And I had never noticed on our household where our utility meter is. So that's all a way of proving that I'm an imposter at an energy forum. In 2006, it was this time of transition as we were selling the last company to Cisco Systems, as Professor Rai mentioned. I saw the movie The Inconvenient Truth, and I started wondering what was going on out there. Were there opportunities to kind of combine doing well and doing good? Again, I don't have an energy background. I don't have a solar background. I don't have a finance background. But I saw that there might be something that was out there that was happening. I was in the middle of a roof replacement for my home. So I went out, like anybody would do, and got 3 different bids to see how much would it actually cost? What's the investment required to get solar on my rooftop? I have a small 3-bedroom home. By Texas standard, that would be very small, I guess, in Palo Alto. And the best quote that I got for, and this was once they had said there's all kinds of incentives out there, the best quote that I got was that it would be a simple payback in, yes, 33 years. This was in 2006 in Palo Alto. Now, Palo Alto is a municipal utility, so their rates are a little bit less, significantly less than in PG&E across the creek from where we live. But this was before I knew anything about who my utility was, or that the rates were different in different utilities, or the difference in a muni and an investor-owned utility. So it's all a fairly fast learning curve. This was 2006. And this was the best of the 3 quotes. And when a salesperson comes and gives you a quote for something that they're trying to sell, I should say a salesperson comes in, you would just assume that they're exaggerating and lying, that mileage will vary, and it's usually not in the favor of the buyer. So that was what the simple payback was. So at that point in time, for a fairly small system on my house, I essentially would have been, I calculated, contributing about $15,000 for the good of the environment to help see movement happening. And of course, I didn't have $15,000 that I wanted to contribute. And even if I had $15,000, I'm not sure I would do it in the form of metal, steel, glass on my rooftop. I think I would do it in the form of a contribution to a Sierra Club or an Environmental Defense Fund, or try to get somebody to buy some acres in Central America and preserve things. It was just, it was not a financially rational decision. As a result, I should say, so the real question, and this is why it's easier to be an entrepreneur now than it ever has been before, is you could just do research online, and a lot of research online. And I tried to figure out why anybody would go solar. And that's when I started learning about things like investment tax credits. I learned about accelerated depreciation. I learned about the California Solar Initiative. And some things all of a sudden became a little more clear why certain entities went solar. But just to give you an additional context there, from the homeowner at that point in time, again, we're going back now to 2006, 2007, and early 2008. It was a very hard decision for a homeowner to go solar. For one thing, the federal investment tax credit, which is a 30% of the value of the system or the cost of the system, applied if you were a corporation. But if you were a resident putting a system on your house, there was a cap at $2,000. So at that point in time, until early 2009, with the stimulus, when the stimulus went into effect, there was a real kind of punishment for an individual putting a system on their rooftop as opposed to a business putting a system on a rooftop. But at that point in time, no business had done, I don't know if it had really been thought of that businesses could put these on residential rooftops and play it out. So one, there was a kind of a artificial cap that was strange. Second, if a homeowner got a system then or today, they don't get to depreciate it. It's like buying your dishwasher or your car or anything else. This is for your personal use. It's personal property. You don't get to do it. If a business owns it, they get the value of depreciation. And in the case of solar, it's depreciated over 5 years. That's the point of time that the business student, policy students are perking up, and probably the chemist students are saying, why do I care about that darn tax code? That's for those darn MBAs. California at this point in time had introduced the California Solar Initiative. It was a, I think, very well-designed program that was supposed to last 10 years. And it was about $3 billion. And it was kind of a step-by-step so that as more solar got into the market and therefore installers and suppliers got more scale, the incentive would go down gradually in a 10-step method. Well, that was supposed to be a 10-year program. It essentially wore out in 3 or 4 years. I don't view that as a bad thing. Now the industry is alive and well for a whole variety of reasons without that state incentive. So if you look at kind of design of incentives and phase-outs, it was as sound a philosophy of a government program as they come. And of course, every time the tiers were going down, the industry would, pull their hair out and say, boy, we're never going to sell another system. If this goes from $250 a watt to $220 a watt to $1.90 a watt, that was also a way to get customers to purchase faster. Is if you say, look, if you do it now, you're going to get $250 a watt. If you wait another couple of weeks, it's probably going down to $220, and then that would happen over and over. But in fact, the system worked pretty well. They also have net metering in most states, and I believe Texas has net metering now. Is it universal? Is it not so universal?
I think it's universal, but I think
Yeah, which actually goes to the idea of, you think of Texas as a market, and Texas is not a market. It's a series of markets, and each market is very different and unique. Yeah.
for example, the co-op pays only the wholesale price.
Yeah.
So it's not net metering. And then Austin has the value of solar, and so they pay it as a separate transaction, and currently it's paying more than the market rate.
Yeah, so policy matters. And that's one of the things that we learned at Solar City fairly early. Again, going back to this period of time, 2006 to 2008, there were no kind of valid distribution channels. You couldn't roll out a product and say, I'm just going to put it into the same as into these supermarkets or big box stores or retail electric channels, or there's no national roofing company to speak of that has share. There were no kind of distribution channels to make it easy to get a product into the market. That doesn't, and so not only were there not very defined companies putting them in, and the installers varied from somebody maybe with 4 or 5 trucks, 20 employees, to kind of what we used to affectionately call a man, a truck, and a dog. The old, what we might think of as kind of old school electricians that wanted to do solar, liked doing it, didn't have purchasing processes, were not particularly sophisticated at quoting or computers. It could be they did 3 or 4 systems a year. They did them for their friends or what have you. Public awareness was very low back in 2006, 2007, 2008, but the public was pretty receptive. And I know this because if you took a community, even a fairly affluent community like, say, Portola Valley, which is next to Menlo Park in Palo Alto, when Solar City, and this was before I joined them, they would just put door hangers on people's doors and do a community town hall type of session at the local community center. They'd get a lot of people who were interested. So in a sense, nobody had pushed out solar before to folks, but people were receptive. At least they wanted to learn on it. So what you got as a result was a combination of what I refer to as kind of dark green customers, hardcore environmentals, those who would have been okay not making an economic decision, but saying, I want the world to go into PV, or kind of the engineers of Silicon Valley, the Big Bang Theory types, who may just think it's kind of neat, it should happen. Maybe they'd go up on their roof and tinker it. They were the ones that, when they would talk to the installer, wanted to know whose panel they were. They would research them in PV Today or in wherever they would do the research. So that's kind of the world that we had then. And voila, no sound effects here, but there was a bit of a perfect storm that happened at that point in time. You had this nascent industry. It had been around 30 plus years. Some of us are old enough to remember President Jimmy Carter and his war on energy, and saying that we're going to put solar up on the White House, and we're going to have a big solar push, and we're going to introduce this investment tax credit, et cetera. But at that point in time, 7 years ago, there was really very little solar around. The total number of solar installations over 30 years in the United States is estimated to be 60,000 over that 30-year period. So, 2,000 a year. Probably half of them were pot growers or living off the grid and didn't want to be counted to the grid. Solar was certainly an unknown commodity to consumers. It was expensive. To many, it was unaesthetic. I think I made up a word there. But it didn't look particularly good. It was not a status symbol like, say, a Prius became a status symbol of somebody who was doing something for possibly a broader good, if not only for what its purpose is. The industry had almost no downstream investment from outside entities. So if you asked a solar installer how are they going to break down their costs, how are they going to make everything more affordable, they would essentially answer in one way, and that was panel prices are going to come down. We have to get panel prices down. And that's true, panel prices had to come down. But even if panel prices came down to zero, you would still have a $6 or $7 a watt installation cost and a lot of other inefficiencies. So kind of at this time, there were a whole bunch of new entrants into the solar world. Maybe because other people saw inconvenient truth, maybe they saw an opportunity, maybe they a whole bunch of reasons. But as opposed to kind of the old guard of solar, where at the annual solar conference, and I went in 2006, I think there were 500 or 600 people in San Jose. I'm going to the session next week in Chicago, and there'll be 30,000 people. All of a sudden, new entrants from marketing, consumer, IT, and finance started coming in there. And at the same time, there was a fairly positive environment from a policy side. You had the California Solar Initiative and Governor Schwarzenegger with the million solar roof thing. By the way, for all the calculations I've done and other people have done, nobody has any idea why they called this a million solar roofs. It really was about 300,000 solar roofs, but it probably just sounded good, and the press person said, let's call it a million. And sure enough, it became a million solar roofs. I have a little asterisk there, which is generally positive, and the asterisk is because I'm here in Texas, albeit in a city that has a very progressive solar attitude. Texas has been historically a challenge in terms of incentives for solar, and you guys, I'm sure, know that and live that in a different way. In 2007, the economics were sound for a lot of people. Maybe the payoffs were outside of the little municipality that I live in. Maybe the payoffs were 12 years, 13 years, 10 years, depending on what kind of electricity you had. That was an okay payback, but it was not a no-brainer. And again, the thinking in the industry was stale. So what you got was this waiting for a whole bunch of things to happen. And that's where I think a new group came in. And it was not without controversy. It was not without finger-pointing. But all of a sudden, some really interesting things happen. I have, and I will confess, a slight bias in my experiences towards Solar City. Peter and Lyndon Rive were the founders. Their first cousin, Elon Musk, put in the initial capital. Peter and Lyndon had done a business before that. Elon had invested in that company. And as legend goes, on the way back from Burning Man, they decided that they were going to start a new type of company to change the way electricity is delivered. And far be it from me to doubt the lore. I do know they go to Burning Man every year, and so it's a good story. There was also a hub of activity in the Bay Area, and it's where a whole variety of companies, all of whom, one way or the other, had kind of close ties to the Stanford Graduate School of Business, which is also a way of saying that hubs are really important and activity is really important. And even though these different groups barely spoke to each other, may not have actually been groups then, if you had something proprietary, you wouldn't have shared it with somebody else. There was kind of something that was happening there that created a bunch of people who wanted to build a new type of platform. And Sunrun came right out of the GSB. I came out of the GSB, a century before that, and Sungevity came out of the CFO leaving SolarCity and going straight to Sungevity. So there was a tie there. But for the first time, there was actually access to downstream capital. It's a very capital-intensive business because, especially when you start floating rebates and putting up from upfront costs, the more you grow, the faster you grow, the faster you run out of money. And this is kind of the catch-22 for the businesses. So you needed some form of outside investment to get some scale. And again, the idea here is not that in order to contribute to solar energy and to renewable energy, you need to study physics, chemistry, or engineering. Bless you if you do. I would have if I were smart enough. I wasn't, and so I instead went into the policy and business world. But these two areas together, working hand in hand, ended up really changing the model. So let's take a look at what happened. And this is, I think, the slide that will be the basis for the rest of this conversation, which is solar was growing a little bit every year. You had a little bit of kick up here. SolarCity was started. A couple others having a little bit of a rate, and then something happened in 2008, and the rest was remarkable growth. If I wrote this in a business plan, or any of you wrote a business plan like this, and showed it to your venture capital friends, they would say, that's a darn hockey stick. Seen a lot of hockey sticks. No business actually grows like that, or very few of them do. So dumb down the numbers some. But what happened here was this is when third-party ownership, solar lease, solar power purchase agreements for homes started kicking in, and it was just an inflection point that took a little bit to catch. And I could talk a little bit later about what happens when you introduce a new model into an existing sales force. But it absolutely took off beyond imagination and certainly beyond my dreams. And it's actually continued. SolarCity's gotten a lot of attention in the last week because they announced that they were going to grow by 90% next year. And almost all of that growth is in residential. So you now have, and this is kind of back of the envelope numbers, SolarCity will install about $2 billion worth of residential solar next year, give or take. Let's just say they're 20% of the industry. They're probably not that high. That means that there's now a $10 billion residential industry every year. And it's growing and growing and is on fire. So, but I want to be really clear. This is not only about financing. There's a lot of other things that have to go into it. The panels dropped. So until this point, solar was really expensive on a cash or a lease basis. It hadn't been available because solar panels were selling at $3.50 a watt. Now they're at about 80 cents a watt. But so that was one obvious breakthrough. Incentives started kicking in around here. That was another helpful breakthrough. But if it had just been a financing play and not been all the other areas of improvement in these platforms, such as monitoring, such as efficient purchasing, such as efficient delivery, so that if you want to install 7 different systems in a neighborhood, you can schedule efficiently so that you have the panel guys come up and the design guys come around and the inverter guys and kind of batch flow it. And that's also where the industry is leading to, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So financing was important. It was the change in the customer adoption model, I think, that made the difference. But without having really good information systems, technology systems, monitoring, you would not have been able to get this outside investment in because you would not have had a window in to see how is this technology actually performing. So what does financing do? It essentially changes the upfront investment from writing a big check to solar as a service. It's a familiar model in the software industry, software as a service, and here you get the solar as a service. Qualified homeowner signs a lease. The system's designed, you complete the project, and then benefits flow. And these benefits, and we could talk about this in more depth to those who are interested, are a combination of federal benefits, the investment tax credit or the 1603 Treasury grant program. In some places there's SRECs, in some places there's rebates. The lease cash flows as a result of net metering. And net metering being you, for every kilowatt hour you put into the grid, you get the cost, the value of what they were paying. So you're paying, as a user, you're paying a retail rate. When you put power in with net metering, you are getting a retail rate back. And that's a fundamental policy that's been really important. And so you get also depreciation if the system is owned by a business and not by a homeowner. So what this leads to is some very sophisticated, complicated financial structuring areas where rebates could go here, tax credits could go there, depreciation can follow a little bit, lease payments from customers could go to this party for this number of years and this party for that number of years. It created a lot of work for tax lawyers and for bankers. And the deals were fairly complicated and really expensive to do at the first part. You couldn't have done this if you were just a regular installer with 5, 10, 20 trucks, 50 employees without it. You had to, have a really large opportunity ahead of you, and B, you had to have a lot of cash to pay the professional service providers. So again, going back to that slide of how the hockey stick took off, leasing, and by leasing I mean both leasing and power purchase agreements, they're two sides of the same coin, became a game changer in the business. A little bit on why it works, and I'm not trying to sell anything here. It morphs the selling process. So instead of saying to somebody, pay me $20,000 up front for a 4-kilowatt system, and it's going to benefit you for a long period of time, and you're going to get 15% IRR on your money and all these complicated things, it takes away what that issue is, especially a kind of no money down lease. But in addition to that, it shifts the responsibility. When somebody's selling you something, particularly if it's a new technology, you're going to be skeptical as to whether that pitch is really working or not. When somebody says, we're going to be the responsible party and you're going to pay us based on what it produces, and we're going to guarantee it produces it, and if it doesn't, we're going to write you a check for whatever the balance is, it all of a sudden really changes the psychology. And I think this is one of the really interesting areas of diffusion of the technology, is where the psychology is. It goes a lot beyond the dollars and cents. Say hello for me. Not at all. So the other thing it does is, when you think of getting energy into your house, you buy a house, you're renting a house, you call up the utility and you say, turn on my gas and electric. They don't say, well, let's see, you have to prepay 20 years of your gas and electric. So it's going to cost you $1,000 a year for your energy, pay us $20,000, and you're going to benefit over this for 20 years. You know, that's not how utilities, that's not how your telephone works, it's not how your cable works. So instead, if you can offer a visible reduction in bills and lock in rates. Now, again, this is a little bit of a time-dated thing. In a world where rates are not going up very fast because our economy has slowed down, because natural gas has come in. In Texas, you have all kinds of competitive offerings. The escalator may not be an issue. In California, after the energy crisis that brought down our governor and one of your companies here in Texas and some others, there was a real fear of rates going further and further up. So And the other thing I think it did was it allowed people to kind of do the right thing. And I don't mean to be judgmental or holier than thou on that. I think a lot of people would like to see a greater use of domestic energy production, whether they're environmental or not. As Tom Friedman said, we at some point we have to stop financing both sides of the war. And I think for a whole lot of reasons, people want to go solar. And again, that may come out in some of the research areas that we would, and we learned that we had to market differently to the Greens, the environmentally oriented people, and for those who kind of thought of the utility as the man, the bad guy, or imported energy. And that's targeted marketing messages. But what you had that was universal was in every territory where third-party systems ownership were introduced, you had this really rapid uptake for how they would happen. This has Arizona, California, Maryland, and Massachusetts in here. You had huge preference. And so what happened, and there may be some other installers in a room who could speak to this, the whole selling arrangement changed. And so people started talking to their friends, and I knew that this was successful fairly early on when I was on an airplane, and I heard the guy in back of me telling the guy sitting next to him that he had leased solar, and he showed him the savings that he was getting from that leasing of solar. So people started becoming evangelical about it. That's the early adopter model, people who like to try new things and explain to new things, but it took off. And today, at least for Solar City, I think maybe 95, 97% of their sales are leases. That could also be because if you think of a lease, you're thinking of Solar City. So it's not necessarily across the board. But given a choice, over 80, 85 people will choose solar leasing or PPA. Just short digression. Before we introduced solar lease in the spring of 2008, we did some focus groups to find out about names and how we should name it. So, of course, what we did was we went to Phoenix and the Central Valley and an affluent area of the Bay Area, and Los Angeles ran these focus groups, blah, blah, blah. Across the board, the feedback came back saying, I will not lease these things. That's not who I am. Leases are for aspirational people who don't have the money in their pockets. They're those kind of show-offy young people who can't afford a BMW, but they lease a BMW anyway. So I would not buy anything that had solar lease. Our CEO, Lyndon, very smart guy, very instinctive, almost in a Steve Jobs-like way, and say, they don't know what they want. We're going to call this solar lease because that's what it is, and we're going to go there, and that's what happens. So, marketing studies are important. Instinct is important too. But what's clear here is that it's universally true. And we could get into some additional discussion on this for what happens when some of the advantages like the ITC decline. Will leasing, will financing make a difference? So a couple additional observations I'm going to throw out, which is, and I alluded to this, pay-as-you-go systems are not new, and they're not new in the U.S., certainly. So whether it's for phone, for electricity, there was a famous business case on copiers. You tried to sell the first copiers, and it was $5,000 in the 1950s or whatever, and they couldn't sell them. And then they started saying, 10 cents a copy, and they sold like crazy. And so as you push the units closer to pay-as-you-go, it's a much more easy way to gain acceptance as opposed to prepaying for a long period of time, especially for a technology that very few people know about, very few people trust, and it's your first system. It's not a replacement for your last car, your last water heater, your last Blue Blazer. This Blue Blazer gets old. I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the store and buy another Blue Blazer. This is not a replacement purchase at this point in time. Another set of observations, and this is really trying to think of where research might go, where efforts might go, where MBA projects could go. I think there's a lot of areas for new innovation. One is combining photovoltaics and energy efficiency. You can throw onto that putting some batteries into the system with intelligent software, understanding time of use, understanding where the various economic incentives sit will matter. Looking at parallel type of investments, geothermal heat pumps, reverse heat pumps, that especially in the Northeast where they use gas to heat, oil to heat, digging into the ground and running a loop 300 feet either down or 300 feet around, I think has some promise. Solar hot water, small wind is a possibility. Again, for these to adopt, you're going to need a whole bunch of things for that perfect storm. It may be policy. It may be entrepreneurs who have the vision. It may be a technology that is more trustworthy. But I think there's a lot of opportunities there. For you hardcore finance types, I'm not one of them, I think that it will evolve from a lease to a PPA. Again, I can talk about why we went to a lease and not a PPA from the start. And then I think there'll be some interesting indexing and hedging strategies. At some point in time when there's hundreds of thousands of systems out there, and that's now happening, one should be able to hedge. A cloudy month that means less production here may mean more snowfall in the Sierras, which is good for the ski resorts. And so the solar guys may be willing to buy a hedge against snowfall, and the snowfall guys may be willing to say, boy, if it's sunny this month, it's good for the solar guys, but it's terrible for the ski resorts. So I think there'll be some interesting kind of opportunities to do some indexing, hedging, and all kinds of stuff that I really don't understand. There's securitization of assets. That's an effort that's going on now, and I see Jason here from one of your colleagues, classmates who I got to work with at Sunshot. There's an effort that's going on, sponsored by DOE and Sunshot, for capitalizing for a securitization. Basically means you take a whole lot of pools of similar types of credit. So a solar system paying $80 a month in Austin and a solar system paying $93 a month in Sacramento and here and there. You put them together, you get a diversified portfolio, and hopefully a good rating on it that actually is validated by customers continuing to pay. With that, you get two things. One, the rest of us can invest in solar because it will be more like a debt instrument, which we could talk about. And the second thing you'll get is because there'll be more investors rather than this oligopoly of tax equity investors, which is a few banks that are kind of household names. They get to charge way too much for putting the money out there. And this is again part of what Sunshot is doing in addition to the physics and chemistry, is putting a sledgehammer to soft cost. There's so much fat in our installation cost systems here relative to where we can be and relative to, say, where Germany is today on the installations. Community solar is another area for innovation. That's essentially the idea. You live in an apartment, you live in a house for a few years, you live in a place with shade, you want to own 5 kilowatts of solar. Because you use 5 kilowatts of solar, you can't put it on your rooftop. There's a park nearby, there's a generation facility somewhere. Is there a way to be able to be a supporter, user of solar power for this and wind? And then there's other opportunities. This is what excites me these days, is globalizing some of the lessons of customer behavior and financing. In other countries, I'm actually living in Mexico this year, working on a new business to try to bring solar into Mexico. There's island economies that are just staggering how much they have to pay to import their electricity. 40, 50, 60, 70 cents a kilowatt hour is quite common. They may be subsidized at the end unit, but at some point in time, somebody is paying that 40, 50, 70 cents for diesel. And last, I'm quite interested in seeing if and how, and I'm involved in a company in India that is doing this, is trying to use a pay-as-you-go system, they're called Simpa networks, to bring, to do what happened in the phone line systems, which is the phone lines weren't reaching everywhere. Instead of waiting for those to happen, cell phones essentially did a leapfrog on technology through. And it's possible that some form of distributed energy or solar home systems or other can do a similar thing. It's not without challenge, but I think it's really interesting and exciting and really important, as in India alone, 250 million homes do not have access to electricity. 250 million people don't have access to electricity. Couple quick observations. It's not cost per watt that anybody cares about, but it's really cost per kilowatt hour, or if you go back to the original stuff, I just wanted to have electricity, or as my colleague from Solar City, Colin Murchie, says, people just want cold beer. So they want to make sure that their beer is going to be cold. I think third-party ownership, as it is now, is here to stay for a while, but there's a ton of more innovation and structures that will happen, and whether that's PACE financing or home equity loans or hybrid PPAs, we shall see. For the policy people, I think that we're going to see a big shift from direct checks being written from government to indirect, and by indirect, I'm thinking of things like rate structures and tariff structures on what you're paying for the offsetting electricity. Maybe it's going to be a cap and trade, maybe something for externalities, maybe some benefit that gets provided for putting power into the grid when the demand is the greatest during the heat of the day, when the air conditioning and refrigeration is running the most. I think it's going to be, but again, I think that's going to be human intervention and policies, but not necessarily we're going to give you $2 a watt to install this type of system. Data matters. We're now getting to a point in the world where we have the ability to obtain and to access and to crunch big data, whether it's for adoption, whether it's for use, how these systems are being used. And it's going to be a very exciting time, I think, to be a researcher in the area of the field. And so hats off to Professor Rai and the work that you and your colleagues are doing around dissemination. That's enough about me. So thank you, and let me open this up to questions.
So you talked about third-party ownership. You talked about third-party ownership.
Go ahead. It's fun.
And it seems like you're really high on leasing, and Solar City has a lot of people within these 20-year agreements, but this is a pretty high-tech industry. Technology is evolving and changing all the time, particularly with batteries is the one that I see coming down the pipeline. The other thing you're seeing changing is net metering laws, and so I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to how the third-party ownership, or if Solar City has some sort of plan to address those issues. I mean, if I see a situation playing out where utilities start charging solar customers not one-to-one for net metering, but we're going to charge you an extra 2 cents, and then years later a battery comes out. Well, why am I paying this extra 2 cents of electricity that I wasn't supposed to be paying when Jim down the street just got a solar system with a battery on it and is never having to pay the utility again? Second point, if you could speak a little bit to the decline in third-party ownership in California. And finally, when Solar City coming to Texas?
Okay, that's a lot of questions all at once. I'll answer the last one first, which is Solar City has been in. So, first of all, I don't speak for Solar City anymore, and nor do I speak for the U.S. Department of Energy or the government. I'm a consultant there, and I should have said that at the very beginning, and I advised them on financing. Solar City started in Dallas a few years ago. They ran a very a successful and high-profile campaign. Since then, I think they've been dabbling here and there, and there was a gentleman here that was saying they're a little bit here, a little bit there. I don't think it's been one of their focus areas. It's a tough policy environment. Incentives come and go, and budgets for rebates tend to drive a whole lot of people in, including Solar City in a big way. And then when they dry up and they don't get rebudgeted, or there are rules that get put in place so that no one entity can have more than a certain amount of market share, those are all things that they look at that affect things. In the long run, you can't avoid, Texas is a terrific state for solar once everything gets stretched out, but I don't think they do much there. In terms of the technology obsolescence, I'm gonna say, which is solar panels may just need to be replaced at some point, or the homeowner may benefit from a replacement in these systems. Homeowners have signed a 20-year lease. All of a sudden, they see somebody down the street who got a new system. It was a lot cheaper than their system. It's producing twice as much power. We haven't seen any indication of that 5 years in, and it's partly because it takes a long time for these new technologies to be invented, commercialized, gone to scale, and financeable. Some of the players behind the curtain, if you will, are the finance players. And when you do these really thick documents that I was referring to the lawyers doing well on, you'll have a list of approved providers, approved technology people. You can't just put out whatever you want and say, financier, pay for it. So you have not had very much evolution in these technologies. The inverters will get a little bit better. The panels will get a little bit better, but a little bit better over a few-year period is not very big on the percentage. So the batteries, as I understand it, they're still not yet ready for prime time. I wish it were otherwise.
Do you think they'll be ready in 10 years?
Yeah. But I don't know why. I can't tell you what has to happen scientifically or commercially. I think you'll see it first in the large commercial systems, and then only towards the end, except for the few people who want to kind of be independent and off the grid. I don't think they will have it. I think other types of batteries will play into it. On my home in Palo Alto, I have a 3-kilowatt system on my rooftop. I also have a Nissan Leaf in my driveway. And it could be at some point my Nissan Leaf is the battery that during off hours charges other things. So I think we're going to see different models, different kinds of innovation. I don't know how fast battery technology will evolve. I don't think it's going to affect any of the growth rates that you see here, and I don't think it's going to affect payment very much.
Past customers, I guess that's my bigger question. Like the net metering model the net metering past, or I freak out when DirecTV tells me I have to sign up for 3 years. You're telling me I have to sign up for 20 years.
Yeah. You bought a house yet? So that's 30 years. But it.
If I can resell it.
Yeah. No, look, not everybody. You're in a relationship with your energy provider for the life of the house, which actually goes beyond where you are. You can transfer the lease to the new buyer if they want to do that. There could be some issues downstream, and that's an interesting kind of customer behavior thing. But the core question that you had was.
My core question is if policies change.
Oh, policy change. Yeah.
I was paying 9 cents a kilowatt hour, which is a good price, but then suddenly I'm getting charged 2 cents a kilowatt hour by the utility for net metering, or something else changes where I'm suddenly not getting the deal I was originally proposed. How does the lease structure, all that? And I guess that I was hinting to
Yeah.
why people are that.
Yeah. So that's a nightmare when retroactively a tax happens. So it could be that when your sales guy shows you, here's how much you're going to save over time, and they're saying it's going to go up 4% a year, and we're going to have an escalator at 3%, and it turns out it's flat. So you kind of get like a frog, you get foiled. So you only see it a little bit at a time, as opposed to getting a thing in the mail saying you now owe another $30 a month to the utility because they're providing all the transmission and distribution. They pass a retroactive thing. So one thing is, when you have enough people that in the installed base that get angry, it's harder to do anything retrospectively. It could happen. Taxes do get imposed retroactively. Utilities have tried to impose these retroactively, and solar is still in the early time of adoption, but these guys get their voices out very quickly and loudly, and people don't get reelected when ugly retroactive taxes happen. It's not to say that what might happen is there may be groups that say, look, you can't take all this money out of the utility system. And so therefore, in the future, we have to increase what that amount's going to be. And then that's going to be an extra cost, if you will, that while we've done everything to bring the equipment down and the installation down and the customer acquisition down, now the cost has gone up a little bit because something has to get paid to the utility. I believe that utilities hate distributed, for the most part, hate distributed solar, would like to crush it any which way they can, and are sitting in whatever consulting rooms or practices that they have now, engaging with people to say, how can we crush this thing? Those are some utilities. Other utilities are saying, this is like the landline world of the 80s and the 70s and the 80s, saying that cellular thing is going to be a passing thing, or people will always need their landlines, and let's not worry about the cellular thing now. Pagers never took off, so why should we worry about it? And it turns out that I think the smart utilities will be ones that look at, invest, get involved with. But they're not the friends. And it's not just the utilities, it's also the political influence, and I know where I'm standing, of oil, coal, and gas that have been buying and selling politicians for generations and generations, and can raise more for a breakfast than the solar industry has been able to raise in a year for every friend of solar. So there's real political challenges, but I digress. Yes?
My name is John. I'm currently a policy student at the LBJ school, and I guess since we've been talking about hypotheticals, I'm just going to keep going.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of trade issues going on with China, who is the main supplier of inexpensive PV technology. Do you foresee, if there's a trade dispute coming up, that underlying assumption of cheap PV technology will alter this leasing agreement scheme that you've described to us?
I don't think it will alter the leasing per se. I think the cost of a system, whoever has to bear that, will go up. And if it's a leasing company, and they used to be able to charge essentially 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and there's a new cost in there, and they can't pass that cost through because they want to save against the customer's bill, it's going to be, it's going to cost. Somebody's going to have to absorb that cost, but I don't think it's going to make a difference. The question before also was, why might there be a downtick in third-party ownership? It could be there's better finance products out there from like Admiral's Bank, or some people may be more willing to pay cash. It was surprising to see it in the data, and I'd want to see another quarter of data that shows that trend to understand what's going on. It could be poor reporting because of the CSI. The best thing about one of the best things, in addition to money, about the California Solar Initiative was there had to be really strong reporting. So every system that got installed and that got a government incentive, you had to report whose panel it was, whose inverter it was, who the installer was, and that got published on the web right away. And so you had great transparency of data. Now you don't have that anymore, and it could be that people don't want to fill in that form anymore. Not sure. So the speculation is there may be better loan products out there, but I haven't seen any indication that that is actually what's happening.
Again, thank you
Sure.
for your presentation. You know, here in Texas, you've noted we're not terribly progressive in our statewide policies. Just almost curiously, you know, because of the competitive renewable energy zone legislation that went through in the late 90s, Texas now is the leader in wind, and I think it's largely because it's a model that Texans understand. You know, a large company comes in, offers you a signing bonus, and then you get some, you know, percentage of revenues from the wind energy. It's really a whole lot like the old, you know, oil and gas model that we are so familiar with in this state. And these policies almost maybe snuck through the legislature, and voila, before you know it, we're leading the nation in wind. Another policy that got through in the late 90s was an exemption for the homeowner for renewable energy equipment as ad valorem taxes. So because of that, I can submit a request. I have to do it yearly. I have to submit a request to exempt the solar, thermal, and solar PV systems that I have. But, you know, they add value to the house if I were to sell it, but they don't cost me any more in taxes. How would that work in a situation in Texas where you have to, you get an exemption from the ad valorem taxes for a leased system?
So there has to be an interpretation that it doesn't matter who the owner of that system is. That to encourage the dispersion and the growth of the industry, you know, no taxes are due on that. I'm surprised actually that with the ad valorem that you need to, if I have a $200,000 house in Dallas and I put a $10,000 system on my roof, I would otherwise be paying $210,000
Yeah, well,
as a basis of the property. But if I bought a new countertop or put a nice pool table, I wouldn't have to pay a tax on that. So they reassess your property based on what you have on the roof.
well, the pool table might go with you when you move.
Yeah.
The counter might not, but
Yeah.
I don't think Google Earth can see into what kind of counters you have. They can see that you have solar equipment on your roof. The appraisal district, the local appraisal district, you know, sent me a letter this year saying, we see that you have solar equipment on your roof. You have the option to avoid taxes on that increased value of your property. I would think a swimming pool would be a better situation. But, you know, it just seems to me if I'm a renter and I've signed a 20-year lease agreement with Solar City, and then I suddenly, well, let's say I'm a homeowner and I've signed and suddenly I get a message from the Travis Appraisal District that I've got to pay more taxes on my property because of this, you know, it's...
Yeah. So in that case, it would be Solar City that would have to pay the taxes. And when they looked at how they were going to price that system for you, this is what I used to do, we would have to figure out all of the different taxes that get involved and come up to crunch that number. And then at the end of the day say, we think we can save you 15%, or, you know, numbers aren't going to work here because of this. And then if that's the case, then you go to you hire your lobbyists, you go to the industry association. If Solar City is feeling it, everybody else is feeling it too. Then you know, you do political advocacy to change things. And your wind example is interesting. I look at if you own a big piece of land and you lease it to a wind farm and you get 5% a year of whatever is being produced from that system, you're basically getting rent for your land. If you have a roof and somebody else is putting equipment on it and you're saving 5% on your electricity, you're basically renting your roof for that benefit, although the payment stream isn't going in that particular way. But in that sense, I think of it as roof rental. It's the economics, the savings are going somewhere, and in this case, it's going to the homeowner. So, maybe it's nomenclature.
I guess lease option would include the ability here for leased solar for the company to get the tax credit rather than...
Right, that's right. Oh, okay, thank you. Awesome.